Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm delighted to be here today to celebrate and recognize extraordinary investigative journalism. I'm Beena Venkatraman. I'm at the Washington Post, formerly of the Boston Globe. So I'm, reminded of what weather in Boston is like in the spring, which is basically the same as the winter. And I'm just excited to welcome and introduce this panel who represent the finalists for the Goldsmith Investigative Journalism Prize this year, which was, I will say, having served on the jury, an extraordinary pool of investigative journalism series from all over the country, looking at everything from local corruption in juvenile justice systems to major national scandals in healthcare, in the Supreme Court. And these really represent the creme de la creme, the sort of series that rose to the top because of their rigor, their public impact. And it's so important. If you're in this room, you probably already know, so I won't spend too much time on this and get us right to the conversation with these folks. But this is really about holding folks accountable for upholding the public trust, the people we elect, the people that are appointed to public office, the people that are supposed to govern and hold accountable the private sector to do its job. And these journalists are shining a light on areas where there's been a failure of that public service mission. And it's so critical to the functioning of our democracy. It's so critical to the functioning of these institutions. So it's, for me, a real honor to be in conversation with all of you. So let me start at the end and work myself back and introduce you, and then we'll dive in with each of the folks. So at the end, we have Michael Sala, who's here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and also his colleague, Ziva Brandstetter from ProPublica, who was the collaborator on the series between the two organizations that exposed really a scandal at Philips Respironics in its production of CPAP machines and ignoring some major side effects that were having an effect on patients, in some cases a deadly effect, and we'll hear more about that soon. Next to him, we have Kirsten Danis of the New York Times, who is the editor of an extraordinary series called Alone and Exploited, penned by Hannah Dreier, who I heard just has a 2-week-old baby, so is not with us today. But this series really looked at the migrant labor crisis and really the crisis of child migrant labor all across the 50 states, and we'll hear more about that. Next to her, we have Alyssa Daly, who's also here from the New York Times, but represents a project that's a collaboration of Mississippi Today and the New York Times that exposed a really extraordinary corruption among sheriffs in Mississippi, extending across numerous counties, abuses of power, sexual abuse, a lack of accountability that has triggered investigations that we hope will bear fruit. Maybe we'll hear more about that. Next to Alyssa is Joshua Kaplan, who's here from ProPublica, who is one of the team responsible for the series Friends of the Court, which you probably, if you've heard of any of these series, this is the one that sort of hit in terms of making a lot of waves in broadcast news, which was about exposing the extraordinary conflicts of interest of Supreme Court justices, including Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Samuel Alito. And thank you for being here. Next to him, we have Bob Herman, who's here from STAT. Bob represents a series that is called Denied by AI, which is about the use of algorithms in denying healthcare from one of the major health insurers in the country and through Medicare, the Medicare Advantage program, which affects so many millions of Americans and will affect probably all of us ultimately. And this series really looked at the ways that that discriminatory algorithm is being used, and I think represents sort of a vanguard of where journalism is going to go in the age of AI. And next to him, we have Jesse Coburn, who had an extraordinary inventive series for Streets Blog, where he's a journalist, looking at the way in which temporary tags, which are fraudulently given out to people for their cars, have been used to cover up all kinds of crimes and allow a lot of accountability for petty crimes, but even violent crimes to go missed in New York City and beyond. Welcome, Jesse. So as you can see, this is an extraordinary group, and I just flew through that introduction so that we could dive deeper with each person. And Alyssa, I would actually love to start with you, since you're there in the middle. And so tell us more. So you did this series, just to remind folks, about the sheriffs in Mississippi, and some of them known as the Goon Squad even. So some real violence, sexual abuse, for which they were not being held accountable, even though some people knew about some of these abuses. Can you tell us more about how you and your collaborators at Mississippi Today found this story? Uh, what did you, yeah, how did you get it? How did you get people to talk to you also?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. My colleague Jerry Mitchell, who's sitting right in the front, you wave, Jerry. We originally started out working on a completely different story. We were investigating a possible case of wrongful conviction out of Clay County, Mississippi. And so, in working on that story, we had found out that some of the deputies who worked on this case lied in their trial testimony. And so, in backgrounding some of the deputies in this case, we came to find out that some of them had gone on to do other things in other police departments across the country. And so, for the case for one of them that we had looked at, this particular deputy had gone on to work for New Orleans PD and was the subject of a criminal probe because he was caught on a hot body cam making a wrongful arrest and then instructing the other officers with him on how they were going to lie their way out of that arrest. And so it begged two different questions for Jerry and I. The first question was, well, we see that this conviction was successful for them. So what were they doing before this woman was convicted? And then it also begged, what were they doing after? And we eventually made a couple of more calls and we started digging around and we came to find out that the sheriff of this particular county was the subject of a federal lawsuit where he was accused of sexual harassment by one of his former female employees. And in this lawsuit detailed other horrific allegations of abuse, that there was a woman who accused him of raping her repeatedly while she was incarcerated in his jail for about 8 months in 2017. And that after she started telling other people about what had happened to her, she was arrested twice for drugs, and that there was a recording of this drug dealer who talked about how he had planted meth in her car at the behest of one of the sheriff's deputies. And so that was really the first story that Jerry and I came across and had really began to dig into. And, working on it was really difficult. This community in Clay County, Mississippi, the town is West Point, Mississippi. There's a lot of poverty. People face a lot of addiction, financial hardship. It was really difficult, earning and gaining and keeping that trust with people in that community. We spent so much time with them though, and we spent so much time with people just asking them, what their experiences were like with law enforcement, what their experiences were like, day to day in the county. And we were able to build a lot of trust that way.
One of the challenges with series like this, where people are accusing the powerful of abuse, is corroborating the stories. And one thing I found so fascinating about your process in looking at this series is that you looked to corroborate that, not just through sort of traditional, can we corroborate that this person experienced this at this time by talking to their friends, but through looking at logs for tasers used by the sheriffs. Can
Yeah.
you talk about that?
Yeah, so that was my amazing colleagues, Nate and Brian, who are also somewhere here. So they worked on a really great story about the Goon Squad. And so for anyone who has seen the news, I mean, it was a national story back in January after these two men were essentially tortured by deputies out of the Rankin County Sheriff's Office, and one of them was shot in the mouth. And so Mississippi Today and the New York Times tasked my colleagues Brian and Nate with looking at, well, we know that this horrific incident happened. What else is out there? And so they ended up getting all this taser log data that had to be cleaned, and all this all this data work had gone into it. I don't know the specifics, but if anyone wants to know, they're here and they can be asked later. But it's a innovative use of these taser logs because they were essentially able to corroborate certain allegations of when someone would say, well, this deputy did this to me. They were able to see through taser logs, well, the taser logs showed that someone was shocked, but the police reports wouldn't mention that. In a lot of these cases, there was no mention of taser log use, but the taser log data said otherwise. It was really, really incredible what they were able to do.
Really fascinating. And can you just tell us quickly? I want to make sure we move through everyone, because there's so many rich stories here. But there has been some impact. The FBI launched an investigation into at least one of these sheriffs. Can you say more about where that is?
Yeah, I can't say everything, just, I for protection, but we actually there's a sheriff who's planning to plead guilty from one of our story after one of our stories ran. The FBI is looking into the Goon Squad, and that story showed that this band of deputies out of the Rankin County Sheriff's Office had been essentially torturing people for going back 20 years. And so, there are still investigations going on into what happened with this office, but also those officers pleaded guilty in federal court last week, 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago. Sentenced. Sorry, sentenced. Sorry, they were sentenced. Sorry, they pleaded guilty a while ago, but they were sentenced, and there was a lot of coverage around that. I know that the state sentencing is what, next week too. So I think we'll be seeing more. And I can also say on the legislative side, I mean, there have been a bunch of bills that have been introduced in order to provide transparency when it comes to Mississippi law enforcement and give their board of law enforcement standards and training the teeth to actually investigate allegations of abuse, something that they've never had the power to do before. So there's been some really great impact as a result of this reporting, and I couldn't be, more happy to know that people in Mississippi are safer as a result of our work.
Congratulations. It's always great when that can happen immediately, though we know it sometimes takes time. Michael and Ziva, if you'd like to join and chime in as well, we'd love to hear from you. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your series exposing these real harms of these CPAP machines. And tell us a little bit, as you do, about how you found the story, about what you encountered at the FDA, which is supposed to be, the agency that oversees the safety of these medical devices. Because I think a lot of that was pretty surprising.
Yeah, so we were alerted to this very early on by a source sent us. So you should be looking at some of these lawsuits that are being filed in federal court in Pittsburgh, personal injury cases involving CPAPs and ventilators. Started to look at them. That was interesting. Then we were able to get an inspection report by the FDA, and the FDA was at that point really cracking down on the company. But the more we started digging, I had reached out to Debbie. Debbie and I had worked together for 20 years, starting at the Miami Herald, and later we worked together at the Washington Post. And as we both started digging in on it, we started noticing there was a huge recall of these machines. So they had already recalled millions, but what wasn't known was how far back the company knew. And so going back through the data, also emails that we were able to get by Phillips engineers, expressing concerns about there's a foam inside these devices that's planted in them to attenuate the sound so people can sleep at night, CPAPs and ventilators in hospitals. The problem was they used the wrong foam, and it started breaking down under heat and moisture. Most of these things get warm. They have humidifiers in them, and they were emitting volatile organic compounds, formaldehyde, phenol, into the lungs of sleeping patients. And so the question was, how far back did it go? And then that's when Debbie and our the Post Gazette's data reporter, Michael Korch, really started digging deep into the data and found that they were getting complaints back in 2010, 2011 about the foam particles breaking down in these machines. People didn't know what it was. They thought it was like, is this dirt? Where is it coming from? And so we realized then that they were they were not only getting complaints, they were holding them back and not turning all of them over to the government as they're required to do within 30 days. So for 10 years, they're basically putting out these machines, they're promoting them, they're advertising them all over the world, health fairs from Dubai to Las Vegas. And they knew that these machines had a really serious problem. And so Eventually, as we started digging deeper, we got to some of the scientists that work in Philips, as well as those that had left, and those that were involved in some of the analysis of the materials. And this had gone back for a long time. They had had emergency meetings in an old bowling alley near Pittsburgh where they had a IT center set up. And they met for weeks in there trying to figure out what do we do. And what they didn't do was they didn't do a recall or they didn't take those off the shelves. They just continued to promote them until it got well beyond, the point where they had to, at some point, they had to actually do a recall, mostly because of scientists within the company that threatened to go public with this. And so the FDA's role. So, while Phillips held back thousands of complaints about contamination, and we're talking about tar and mud, they would call it mud. There was all sorts of things inside these machines that just didn't look right. They also did turn over literally several hundred complaints to the FDA. So the FDA was getting warnings of this going back to 2012, 2013. Now they have within the agency emerging signals. They're supposed to be able to identify certain trends that are occurring in the same products. This was missed completely. And so not only was the company holding back and not turning over everything, but the FDA, what it did know these devices had a serious problem. There was no effort to try to stop the company at any point in time.
Do you, am I right to remember that the FDA actually stonewalled you initially when you were trying to get documents? How did you overcome that?
We filed a lawsuit.
I,
ProPublica's lawyers,
yeah.
Ziva, they all went to work and filed a lawsuit in Southern District of New York Federal Court to get a lot of the records that we were able to then use. Um, Not everything. They're still stalling us and they're still fighting us, but we're not. During the lawyers for ProPublica are not backing down. It's been quite good, and so we have gotten really good stuff, emails and things like that out of there with the FDA and the agency, back and forth.
And I know they've gotten some congressional pressure, the agency, but has anything changed with respect to how they're looking at these reports of things that are going
Yeah,
wrong?
that's a really good question. I think as a result, no, to answer your question, there really isn't. And I don't have a lot of I'm a little bit after a while you get a little inured to seeing the way in which the agency works. But having said that, there was a request from Senator Blumenthal and Senator Durbin for the GOA, the General Accountability Office, the congressional investigative arm, to get involved to look at the way in which the FDA is regulating medical devices. And the GOA accepted it and they've launched their investigation. So hopefully something good will come out.
Siva, did you want to add something? Right. And
Sorry. I mean, the FDA has the authority to find out these issues and, it shouldn't take, a year and, a lawsuit and big team of reporters to like protect the public from dangerous machines.
and you really demonstrated, I think, in creating your own analysis of those data that it's possible to analyze the data and see the signal.
Oh, and went very deep and spent a lot of time on it. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll come back to you. Jesse, can we turn to you with this? As I said, the jury really found this an inventive series, looking at the temporary tags given by fraudulent car dealerships to cars, a lot of cars in New York mainly, with New Jersey and Georgia license plates that then can escape scrutiny of the law because these tags are not really tied to the right, kind of identity. Can you say more about how you even got the idea to do this story? It's unusual, and then how you chased it down.
Sure. So the story really started in the summer of 2021. I started noticing lots of cars with out-of-state temporary license plates in my neighborhood in New York City. For people who don't know, those are those paper license plates that you get from a car dealership when you buy or lease a car, so that you can drive that car off the lot before receiving your metal plates. So it sort of stuck out to me. It struck me as improbable that so many people had just bought cars in, say, Texas or Georgia and all happened to drive to the same residential neighborhoods of outer New York City. So I started looking into it. I started filing public records requests to motor vehicle agencies in New Jersey and Georgia. Those were two states whose STEM tags were common in the city at the time. Sorry about that.
There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that. So I started filing public records requests to motor vehicle agencies in New Jersey and Georgia, those are two states whose STEM tags were common in the city at the time. And then I started speaking to car dealers in those states to try to figure out what was going on. And months down the road, was able to report that basically New Yorkers were opening sham used car dealerships in these states. The regulations around the used car industry are very loose. They were gaining access to government systems for printing temporary license plates, plugging totally fraudulent information into those systems about fake transactions, generating temp tags, and then selling thousands, even tens of thousands of them illegally in New York City. And their buyers were people with suspended driver's licenses, no car insurance, people who didn't want to have to pay tolls, or people who wanted to commit, drive-by shootings and not have, their license plate be connected to their name when the police were investigating the crime later. And it turned out that this whole black market, was sort of dimly sort of known to the regulators responsible for stamping it out, but they proved to be basically incapable of doing anything about it. They would issue these $500 fines after catching a car dealer with no other business activity issuing tens of thousands of temp tags every year. Those tens of thousands of temp tags are worth millions of dollars on the black market. So dealers told me that people were making lots of money perpetuating this scam and basically getting away with it.
It's so interesting because it's one of these areas of governance that it seems like when you look at things like, let's say, mass systems of corruption, covering up high-profile figures who've committed crimes or violent crime. But what you found is this was sort of just the tip of the iceberg, that in some cases there were people who, there was vehicular homicide with some of these vehicles with temporary tags, and there were other crimes that were being committed that were then unenforceable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these tags were showing up in shootings, robberies, hit and runs. And the reason that they're coveted is because they make your car basically untraceable. Um,
Anything surprise you in the process of reporting this?
I was surprised by how easy it was to carry out this scam. In New Jersey and Georgia, it turns out it's remarkably easy to obtain a used car dealership license, and then once you do, even easier to print vast numbers of temp tags while displaying no other discernible business activity. So in Georgia, for example, if you want to be a used car dealer, you don't actually have to have space to display any cars for sale, and you don't need to keep business hours. If you want to print a temp tag, you can plug totally fake information into the system. You can print that tag from anywhere, and there's no limit on the number of tags you can print, which is how you end up having guys who live in Yonkers printing 20,000 temp tags, Georgia temp tags, from their home computer in New York, and then selling them in New York City.
I was surprised by one detail about your reporting, which is that you got people to talk to you who admitted to printing these temp tags. How did you convince them they should talk to you, even though they were doing something illegal?
Yeah, that was really a numbers game. I had, a long list of dealerships that, seemed to me to be doing something suspicious with temp tags, printing a ton of temp tags while displaying no other business activity. Then it was just a matter of figuring out who owned the business, finding their phone number, calling them, and then kind of just working my way down the list until I found a surprising number of people who admitted, yeah, I was selling temp tags illegally, spoke to me on the record, and told me how the whole scam worked.
Wow. You were like the priest and they were in confession. That's what I imagine. Anyway, well, thank you. I want to go to Kirsten Danis, who was the editor of this extraordinary series that the New York Times put out, Alone and Exploited, which showed really the extensive nationwide use of child migrant labor by companies and brands that we know very well, including slaughterhouses that Purdue and Tyson relied on. And ask you, since you were the editor of this series, what convinced you? Because really, there was an extraordinary amount of resources, both Hannah's work and Shoe Leather, getting these stories, talking to these children, but the databases you built, the graphics you created to tell the story. So what convinced you that this was worth pursuing, and how did that process unfold?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Can people hear me? I mean, I'm gonna just confess, speaking of priests, that there were many, many nights where I lay awake at like 3 in the morning. Like, I don't know, is this a story? I think it's a story. I think this is the right approach. So this was not a smooth, process essentially, but it seemed pretty evident from the beginning what this story could be. So for those of you who haven't read all 5 of our stories, I'll just quickly sum it up. Um, this story is about how, during kind of an unprecedented wave of child migration into the United States, children who come alone, who are legally allowed to come alone into the United States, has just exploded since the pandemic. In the past few years, it's been more than 300,000 children, and about a third of them reunite with their parents. But the vast majority of them are coming here specifically to work. And this kind of came out of a conversation that Hannah and I were having. She had done this when she worked for ProPublica several years ago. She had done this really wonderful work about child immigrants on Long Island. And I was a big admirer of that work. She had just started working with me at the Times. And I was just asking about the kids, like, what happened to this kid? What happened to that kid? Do you keep up with them? And she said, well, yeah, well, that kid's working overnight at the cookie factory, and that kid's working overnight at the whatever. And I was like, this is when it actually pays off to be utterly ignorant, because I was just shocked that children were working overnight in a factory. Like, there's so many things that are wrong with that sentence. And it just sort of kind of clicked that if all these children are coming in and they're all coming into work and they don't have work permits because they're supposed to go to school, where are they working? Well, they're probably working jobs that they shouldn't be working. And of course, there was no guarantee, but that was the premise that we started with. And it turned out, so I said to Hannah, where are these kids? And she said, I don't know. And I said, great, we need to go find them. So as the editor, I have the privilege of just kind of demanding this. And we got a lot of data. We had to sue HHS for it, that show which, not by name, but how many children are being released to people not their parents, and where they work. And then we overlaid that data with a US Census map so we could get where the highest concentrations of children were. And then they were in Parksley, Virginia, and in South Dakota, and in Bozeman, Montana, and in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And thus she slowly went to all these places and immersed herself in there for like several weeks. And as she started to do that, it was shockingly, I won't say easy, because she sat outside factories on midnight shifts, and she went to day labor sites before dawn. But it wasn't hard to find children working in jobs that are unambiguously off limits to children, right? We didn't concentrate on children washing dishes even in a restaurant or working at a local tienda or anything like that. We were looking at factories and slaughterhouses and construction sites and roofing and very dangerous jobs. And they were there. They were very easy to find. And so it became quickly apparent that we would start to be able to build this case.
And what were some of the considerations in talking to children and also corroborating children's stories and accounts of this?
So it's a great question. We thought long and hard about this. One thing that both Hannah and I agreed on at the outset of this is that if we were going to do it, we wanted to talk to children on the record. I think there's a lot of really wonderful immigration reporting out there, but I think sometimes if you can't connect with someone, if they're just a first name Maria, and she always went on this long walk to get across the border, and now she's here and something sad is happening to her. We didn't want that story, because we wanted to say, look, these are real kids with real lives, real stories, real families, and they are making your Oreos, they are making your Cheerios, they are slicing up your chicken. We really, really felt strongly about that. But of course, that's a really dicey proposition. Like a lot of these kids are 14, 15 years old. So we had a long talk with many editors at the paper. And what we determined was we would talk to their sponsors when it was safe to do so. We would talk to their parents in mostly Guatemala, but other Central American countries. We had to, who don't even generally speak Spanish, we had to find interpreters in the highlands to help us out. Um, and if they all agreed and they understood what a newspaper was and they understood that, we would proceed that way. And that's what we did. And but still, it was a little nerve wracking. We were very concerned that we didn't put any child in the paper who we thought obviously could be in any danger whatsoever. But we did, and we obviously knew that children could lose their jobs. But frankly, no child should be in any of these jobs. Like it was not a question. And while we certainly wouldn't want to economically damage a family, we felt as though on balance it was the right decision. And I'm very happy to say that every child whose name we published immediately got help, either from readers or from the government or from local lawyers, and are generally far better off than they were.
This week, the Post had a kind of dispiriting story about states reforming their child labor laws in both directions, some to weaken them so that 16 and 17-year-olds can become apprentice roofers and sort of so they can employ minors. But your series really did have a significant impact in terms of public scrutiny. And I think we can say at least maybe it sparked Susan Rice's resignation or contributed to that. Can you say more about your assessment from where we sit now of the impact of this reporting?
I'm really torn about impact. I really struggle with the word, with the being the end game of our work. It did have what I hope to be, pretty significant impact. The White House responded 3 days later. They announced a crackdown. They doubled labor inspections. They got every single kid who comes into the system, at least a few months of social services, which they didn't have before. There were state laws that were enacted. Companies allegedly reformed some of their practices. They changed their auditing procedures. So I think it did have, hopefully had some impact. Did I eliminate child labor in the United States of America? No, probably not. And I try really hard to accept the successes that we had and hope that we at least, held the government's feet to the fire in keeping the promise it made in 1938 to not populate its factories and mines and slaughterhouses with children. I think, hopefully, and the nice thing is other newspapers have also, we published our data and other newspapers have picked it up too. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, the impact thing. But I'm pretty hopeful that, we've made some change.
Yeah, and it's hard to know immediately always what the impact is,
Sure.
but it certainly has had a huge effect. Bob, I want to bring you into this conversation. As I mentioned, the jury sort of saw this series in a way as perhaps a sign of where a lot of investigative journalism could go, or maybe even ought to go, in terms of creating accountability, not just around explicit government policies and actions of public officials, but around algorithms and AI and the use of automated systems to make decisions that affect people's lives. And this series exposed how an algorithm relied upon by United Healthcare was making discriminatory decisions that affected whether people got care, life-saving care, rehab care. And I want to ask you about that process of trying to investigate an algorithm, because in any given case where someone is either denied or given insurance for some amount of medical care they need, you can't necessarily tell whether that decision is a good decision or a bad decision. So how did you go about figuring out whether this was a pattern for which the algorithm and the people who relied on the algorithm, most importantly, were to blame?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Um, yeah, I think a hard part was confirming how this algorithm was A, being used, first of all, and then B, that it was leading to these harmful effects. And the story really started, I think a lot of how our story started from a tip, and is this very angry nursing home someone who worked in the nursing home industry, and they just were so mad that there's these tons of payment denials, and but these Medicare Advantage plans were citing algorithms, like our algorithm said this, and so there was a natural curiosity. Okay, what's the algorithm? Can I learn more about it? And every time the Medicare Advantage plan was like, no, it's proprietary. Just deal with it. And so when we heard that, we're like, okay, that's weird. What eventually got us to the point where we realized that this was a pattern, that algorithms were being used, was when we found court filing documents in which a federal judge said, you know, hey, this Navi Health algorithm said this person only needed 17 days of care in a nursing home. We don't think that's right. And we're going to overturn it, and we're going to make the insurance company pay. And eventually, there was just a pattern of those court decisions, and honestly, whistleblowers coming to us saying, yes, this happened. And a big breakthrough was our third story, in which we got internal documents that kind of showed how people's job performances were based on whether they adhered to the algorithm or not. So we knew that it was being used. United had always told us it's just a guide. But everything we had gathered up until that point was it's not a guide. You have to pretty much stick to it, and there's almost no variance. So it was just a lot of repetitive to make sure that algorithms were being used, and getting the documentation, I think, really made us feel more ironclad when we went to the company to figure out what was going on.
And I guess the challenge here is partially that an algorithm being used in of itself doesn't necessarily prove a public harm. So how did you go about uh, proving that the way it was being used and relied upon was actually systematically harming people?
Right. That's important because a lot of people said an algorithm in and of itself isn't necessarily an evil or a bad thing. And we understood that. Like the intentions are, let's use this data set to understand how patients should be recovering, and this technology will help us maybe make better decisions. The problem was using this tool as a fast and hard rule instead of the guide. When we want to understand how much care someone needs after they leave a hospital, you know, there's ideas based on their age and their comorbidities and how sick they are, maybe how long they should be in a nursing home. But it's kind of making it, okay, this is the rule instead of this is what we think you should stay. That's when it became problematic. And it led to financial ruin for some people, all because of this algorithm that they didn't even know was making these decisions. That's another problem, is a lot of people didn't even know this was being factored into their care. Can you imagine going into a nursing home, telling to pack up and get out after 17 days, and you had no clue that it was because of some algorithm that said you didn't need any longer time than that. So
And how did were the whistleblowers apparent to begin with, or did they come out after the first installment of the series?
after our first story, one of our editors suggested we put a reader submission box at the bottom, and it turned out to be a genius idea because we just floodgates opened. People were like, thank God, like you're writing about this. This is going on, and it led to our second story, and it was this big snowball effect. More people you publish one story and it leads to more people coming out, and it's exactly what happened here. And once we found people, it led to more people recommending other people. So the whistleblowers weren't initially like out in the open, but once they saw that like it was getting attention, they're like, I have more to offer.
Did you have a threshold of how many people you felt needed to, or did your editors have a threshold in terms of how many people would make it a real story?
Um, I think we wanted a critical mass. You mentioned you're just kind of, it was a numbers game. It was a numbers game for us too. We reached out to dozens of people who we thought could be helpful. I think you couldn't just rely on like 2 or 3 people. You'd had to have a pretty wide base. There wasn't like an explicit, you have to have like 10 people, but there was to be ironclad, we want to make sure that we had dozens of people that we spoke with.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure we'll come back to this, and I want to make sure we get time for everyone in the audience to jump in with questions as well. But first, we're going to talk to Joshua about this, the Friends of the Court, this series that ProPublica ran that really exposed the trips funded by billionaires for some of our Supreme Court justices. the conflict of interest, almost direct, in cases that came before the court where there were, payments of trips. How did you decide to go after this story? Was it a rumor mill that started you on this track, and how did it go from there?
Yeah, so um, around the end of 2022, my colleague Justin Elliott and I were talking in vague and ill-defined ways about, oh, what do we want to cover next year? And we were both excited about the idea of trying to cover judges. It just seemed that the judiciary was a branch of government that didn't have the kind of routine investigative scrutiny that so sorry. Didn't have the routine investigative scrutiny that the executive and legislative branches receive. And originally, our thought was that we would focus on the lower courts because they receive, the appellate courts receive almost no investigative coverage. But we spent a couple weeks calling around, trying to formulate story ideas. And as we were reading old clips, became reinterested in Scalia's death, which rather famously, when Scalia died in 2016, he was on a hunting trip at this exclusive ranch owned by this wealthy man who'd recently had a cert petition at the court. And this became public because he happened to pass away while he was there. And so we were thinking, maybe maybe there's more of this. Maybe we started trying to think of how we could report on what the justices do when they're outside off the bench and who has access to them, and quickly realized that the court doesn't have is not subject to public records laws. A lot of the kind of usual disclosure practices that even that other parts of government have don't exist. But there was someone mentioned to us that when the justices travel outside of DC, sometimes they receive security from the U.S. Marshals, and the U.S. Marshals are subject to FOIA, and thus that could be a backdoor into starting to answer this question. And we were formulating our own FOIA, and then heard that this little nonprofit had already requested 2 years of these for all of the justices of these marshals records and had posted them online. And it was about 2,500 pages of records or so. And at first glance, they were so dreadfully boring that we figured maybe no one's ever actually read all of these. It was extremely redacted, even the name of the justice. And it would say, the purpose of the trip was redacted, but it'd be a justice, unclear who, went from DC to Boston on this day. And we sat down and read all of these with our colleague Alex, and kind of pulled out anything that seemed kind of intriguing or maybe had enough information to fill out further. And buried in these was a mention of a private jet that had taken a justice from DC to New Haven and back on the same day. And that really caught our attention, and we were able to dig into that more and figured out that it was Justice Thomas and that he'd gone on Harlan Crow's plane. And at that point, we thought, oh, this maybe could be a story of its own. But it's an easy Amtrak trip to New Haven. It seemed kind of so unusual to use a billionaire's private jet for that we thought maybe maybe this is something he's in the habit of doing. Maybe this is part of a pattern, and that's when we really kind of decided to dig in deeper. And it turned out it was a pattern.
It was hard. Turned out it was Harlan Crow's name in the U.S. Marshals report. So how did you know that it was his jet?
It was not, no. We got the flight data for all of the flights going in and out of New Haven Airport that day. And the only plane that took that route was Harlan Crow's plane.
Mm-hmm. And you also, as I understand, got logs from yachts and tried to find people who were pilots and butlers to be. Is that right? Tell us more about who the people you talked to on this journey.
Yeah, I mean, so I think kind of this is probably obvious to everyone else here, but one of our early realizations was that if you're going to travel like a billionaire or live this lifestyle of a billionaire, there's a lot of people that are going to know about it, just because to have that level of luxury requires an enormous amount of service staff that were in most cases either directly employed by Harlan Crow or were kind of subcontractors of Harlan Crow. And that was, in part because we had no sources at the court. That was really where we focused our efforts, was getting inside these service workers. And so we, I think over the course of the year, our team talked to hundreds of people, the valets at the Bohemian Grove, scuba diving instructors, fishing guides, pilots, and they all had a little piece of the puzzle and were willing to come forward and share that.
Okay, in a moment, I'm going to open it up. This is just to plant a seed with everyone in the room for other people who want to get behind the music here. But I want to ask you one other question, which is about this such an unusual thing that happened during your reporting, which is before your story about Justice Alito came out. Justice Alito, the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed as a former editorial page editor. I just have to say that was a very dubious decision to publish an op-ed of a Supreme Court justice preemptively trying to discredit your story. What was the reaction when that came out in your team? I know you ended up publicly addressing it, but that was so strange.
It was a surprise. We'd been told earlier that day by the Supreme Court press person that Alito wasn't going to be addressing our questions, and we were so happy to hear from her because we'd been trying to build a relationship for a while. And she asked, when is the story going to run? It'll help us get prepared. And we said, definitely not today, maybe as soon as tomorrow. And then a few hours later, Alito published his op-ed saying, I think the headline was "ProPublica misleads its readers," which that annoyed us since the story hadn't come out yet. But he did answer the questions that we'd sent him. And so we were happy to receive a response in any form. And it was a late night, but got the story out, with our editor's help by the end of the evening.
It must have felt a little bit like a compliment to get a preemptive op-ed from a Supreme Court justice before your story even runs.
It was exciting, yeah.
I want to open it up and invite folks in the room who want to ask questions about pulling back the curtain. Yes, and I think there's a mic. Yes, Caroline has a mic. Okay, well, it's for the recording. Yeah, the people on the.
Congratulations to you all, and thank you for your work. My question is for any or all of you. Journalism economically is a brutal business. Investigative journalism, I imagine, even more so. How do you convince people to fund this important work?
Well, yeah.
Sure. I have no role in convincing people. We keep a firewall there, but I mean, ProPublica, it's a for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a nonprofit, entirely funded by donors, and really, all we kind of do is long-term investigative reporting and accountability reporting, and it's amazing because it's a real luxury to be somewhere where frankly, it was a fairly weak pitch. Let's report on judges, and they, gave us the freedom to spend a few weeks trying to flesh that out and turn it into something. So it's exciting to be there.
And it's a not-for-profit model.
Yes.
Just to be clear, that's different than some of the business imperatives of the for-profit model, but a really important public service served by that. Kirsten, did you want to say something?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a scary time for journalism. What we have found is that distinctive reporting that brings up something that's different from everything that's out there, all the noise, actually is something that our readers really want and are willing to pay for. So I would not say that we are one of the big money generators of our newspaper. I might, in fact, suggest that we're kind of a loss leader. But in general, as part of the whole package, I think that our sell job is that we are delivering something that has big impact, that is helping to define the larger news cycle, that is fulfilling our mission, at its core. And is something that readers are willing to pay for because they can't get it on the internet.
I might also slightly add a flavor to this question, if that's okay, and just ask folks if anyone had any real internal obstacles to overcome in terms of getting this work supported. And I mean, you don't have to throw anyone explicitly under the bus, but I don't expect that. If you want to, yeah, we're here, but no. Just
I think
able to get
any
support.
collaboration, brings challenges, up in ProPublica. And while Debbie and I have worked together for 20 years, we knew each other, we could yell at each other, we could, whatever. Um, there is a common goal there, and you always try to overcome that and look that we have differences here, but there's a greater good here, and let's reach that greater good. In our case, people were dying, literally dying on us. We had a person die in hospice before we could reach them. We had another person, gentleman, former attorney general, the state of Louisiana, died 2 weeks after we interviewed him in his kitchen in Baton Rouge. So it was unlike any other story that we had ever covered. Ziva, you remember, and Teresa remembers us talking about these guys. People are dying on us, and we'd never had that happen before. You'd had victims before and after, but not literally while the story was unfolding. So,
Just want to add one thing. You can subscribe to statnews.com to answer your question. But also, and Kirsten kind of got at this as well. When you do kind of, our subscriptions are more expensive than like the New York Times, for example. But, as she mentioned, when people see that there's reporting out there that it is new, illuminating, that aha moment, like you finish reading the story and it's like, wow, this was really good. They feel that the value of the subscription is there. So, I mean, I think the funding model of journalism is tough in general, but maybe there are a couple different ways at least. But it does rely on the support of readers to some degree.
And I think one of the answers is that a lot of journalism businesses, media businesses are trying to figure out how to even subsidize this work with other things they do, like games and cooking and other more profit-centered journalism, because this is part of the public service mission of these organizations. But I also think it's hard to ask journalists this question because part of the answer is the public, right? Like, why doesn't the public value this more? Not what can journalists do to make the public value it more? I do think there's a little bit of more of a bridge in terms of formats that we can be creating to more ways that people natively consume information now and to answer people's questions where they are. But I think it's almost like until the plane, like when the plane door fell off of the Alaska Airlines, it's like then you have a public safety problem, right? And in many of these instances, until it gets big enough that it's causing enough harm, unless journalists are out there exposing this corruption and harm, right? People are really right. The public good is at risk. We're not being served in terms of how we should be served in our democracy. But it's hard to convince people of what happens when you lose that. I think it's sort of like a slowly boiling pot. But I do think there's a growing awareness that we need that kind of journalism and scrutiny when these kinds of incidents happen. We wonder why wasn't anyone looking under the hood at Boeing while it was making those planes, or why wasn't anyone, looking at our local county officials while they were abusing young women, or a variety of things. That's my half-baked answer. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Bina, and all of you. Thank you for your work. Just picking up off this question, because I was having a very interesting conversation with the Neiman Foundation last night. We're all Neiman Fellows over here, these three and a few more. One of the points that's come up recently on this question of getting people to value journalism is, are journalists starting to look at the bigger costs that are incurred when there isn't scrutiny? And I know this is a hard sort of mental framework to get into, but you can contrast the cost of, subscribing to the New York Times or statnews.com or supporting ProPublica with the larger costs of people dying, for example, and track that and show people the relative, the preventive vaccine cost of buying a paper or supporting a news outlet and the larger societal costs that are incurred when there isn't that kind of scrutiny. I'm just curious if any of your news organizations are looking at that. This is from a conversation with Anne-Marie Lipinski. This is not my idea, it's hers. But she's been in contact with some people at HBS who are doing this kind of work. And I'm just wondering if that's something that any of you, your news organizations are doing as part of making the public argument for journalism in a situation where journalism is under attack.
Anyone have thoughts on that? I think it's really fascinating. And I'll just say that I think one of the challenges is the free rider problem, which you have in a lot of these instances. So the fact that exposed this algorithm, or that Alyssa in Mississippi Today exposed the sheriffs, right? We can kind of, without being subscribers, we can kind of ride the coattails of that. Non-subscribers can. I'm a subscriber, so I'm not talking about myself, but you know, and know that that scrutiny happened and that justice happened. And I don't know, like demographically, right? We're losing a lot of people who are subscribers to traditional news organizations just because of the way the population is changing. And so will we come to a tipping point where that you can't be a free rider, right? Like you can't it actually matters to invest, each individual person to invest in their local and in more national as well news organizations. I think it's really worthwhile. Oh, back there and then here too.
Yes, most of you are from large national organizations, but a couple of you, I think, worked with local newspapers, and I just wanted to make the observation that that is very supportive of local newspapers. And I would encourage more of the national organizations to do that because we need local people to do the work that's similar to what you've done so well.
Ziva, did you want to say something about that?
Thanks. I just want to answer that. Just for and I know the New York Times has a similar program. We have the LRN, the Local Reporting Network, and also to address the Neiman Fellows question, that every year we partner with about half a dozen local news organizations and teach them this work. I mean, one of the problems is I spent 30 years in local news and then founded a startup in Oklahoma that's still going, nonprofit. And so I know what it feels like to try to do an investigation without the editorial support and, you know, without the lawyer and without the infrastructure. And so our program, and I'm sure the Times program, is very much focused on giving them the tools to do this even after the fellowship's over.
That's a question.
Hi, I'm Julia Barton. I'm a Neiman Fellow and also an editor of podcasts. And so one of the challenges I think with investigative work is how do you make it a good story without dumbing it down or oversimplifying it? So I'm wondering if any of you want to talk about the challenges of, you know, the fun part's over. You got all the things and now you have to figure out how to tell it. I know ProPublica, you also made a podcast series with one of our Neiman Fellows, Ilya Meritz was involved in that. And that's even another level of like, you know, translating it into another medium. So if any of you want to share your struggles, or the editor, the pain and suffering of that process with investigative series work.
Editors are really good at talking about pain and suffering. You know, I think it's so interesting because I think it does actually speak to a lot of the conversation we have, which is, you know, how do you get people interested in this? You know, one way is to sort of try to measure and quantify the value of this. But also some of it, I think, Bina, you mentioned is sort of meeting people where they are, right? What are the questions they have? And I think the tendency has been in investigations for like, oh, you delve into something, you spend all this time, let's dump it all into 7,000 words, you know, and that we're great, and some people really love to read 7,000 words. But I know when the work that we did this year, we did a sort of opening 5,000 word story, but that really isn't for everybody. It's and so we tried to think about, like, so we did a sort of a deep dive magazine piece also that was just like one person's story, if that's kind of your thing. And then, you know, we thought about it and we said we have all these child roofers, you know, they're outside. We could film them. And so we did one piece that was very few words actually, and just filming kids and using their own TikToks that they made, you know, to sort of that part and incorporating that. And then we made a TikTok version of that story and an Instagram version of that story to try to reach as many people as we could, not just because that's part of our mission, but it's just economically smart, right? Like we have to think about new ways of getting that information out there. It's a great question because it's just something I'm thinking about all the time right now. Shorter stories, longer stories. Like how should we tell these things?
Did someone else want to get in on that one? Yeah, Alyssa. And then over here.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. I just wanted to say that our team would be nothing without our editors. And I remember early on, early on in the reporting, I know my colleague Jerry and I had we'd gone to Chris Davis, who was the main editor for the series, and Dean Beckett, who's the executive editor of the Local Investigations Fellowship, and we had pitched to them this idea of doing one big story on some of the sheriffs that we had been reporting on, and they looked at us and they said, "No, we have to split them apart because each sheriff, there's a different theme to each story." And man, did that work out, because initially we wanted to do one, but by spreading it out and by doing multiple stories, I mean, each story is a standalone, which I'm sure you found that as well when in Hannah's reporting, where there's a different theme, and we would not have arrived to that conclusion had we not had really great editors who were pointing us in the right direction and really molding the stories to what they were.
Love the shout out to editors.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised this year of all years. I haven't heard anybody commenting on pressures or threats about stories. Usually there are people talk about those things, and have we just become nicer?
I would say it's just the opposite. I think that we've gotten very used to adversarial approaches to our work from, I want to say targets, but you'll get lawyers' letters all the time, and there's an art form now that's emerging in our work is how do we reconcile this and deal with it, and how much of it's real, how much of it's not. That's become more of a factor, I think, in the work we do than at any other time. Lawyers. Yeah.
And didn't Hannah have her face on a flyer that was being circulated at the companies that they were like, "Don't talk to this woman"?
Did her face was circulated nationally to slaughterhouses and cleaning companies saying, "Post this up, don't talk to her." We were threatened with lawsuits, like kind of left and right. I mean, they wasn't real, but it has an effect. Like it absolutely, like you know, no matter how great your lawyers are, and ours are wonderful, you know, you do sit. It has it can have a chilling effect, and it's something we have to really try to stop in ourselves and be, you know, be tough and hold the line. But it's getting really bad out there. The weaponization of libel laws is a very real thing.
Actually, Jesse, I was curious for you because you don't have the New York Times behind you, and you received some threats as you were doing this, right? Some of the fraudulent, I guess, I don't know, we can call them dealers, but
Yeah, it was an interesting project to work on from that perspective because I was, you know, basically reporting on criminal activity, and of course had to go to the people who I suspected of committing crimes and say, "Hey, are you committing crimes?" They were understandably not happy with my questions. You know, I faced a lot of threats during my reporting, and then we've also been hit with a lot of, you know, threats of lawsuits since the series came out. No one has actually sued us, but I mean, we benefit from the Cornell First Amendment Law Clinic, which gave the series a legal once over before publishing. But yeah, I mean, I think that is a challenge facing smaller outlets doing this sort of work. Is, you know, I didn't have, you know, you know, 4 editors with a dozen Pulitzers above me, sort of shepherding the story to a successful conclusion, and it definitely felt, you know, risky at times, but ultimately we believed in the reporting and we put it out.
Okay. Anyone else have death threats or
We didn't receive any death threats, but I will say overall, it's been very difficult to communicate with corporate America, just in terms of trying to operate in good faith and get somebody. My colleague Casey Ross, who couldn't be here, shout out to him. He was pulling out his hair trying to work with United Health. Like we had the goods all lined up, and we are like, can we please just like get some good, healthy on the record back and forth? They only offered it on background, and they just made it very tough. And it's like it was very. That's like the new culture now. Is companies they don't really. It's not the threats that maybe that legally others would be getting, but they just make it very difficult to even penetrate that. And then of course that they have big law firms behind them themselves. So that's why, at least for us, it helped to have documents to go to them, and be like, this is what we got. But just working, at least from that point, has made it difficult. And that's always in the back of our mind from a threat point of view.
did you want to add more, Alyssa? I didn't know if you...
I didn't receive any threats personally, but one of our sources was thrown in jail after it came out that she had spoken with us on the record. And so that was something that we had to navigate, especially in these remote areas in rural Mississippi where the sheriffs rule like kings and no one is watching them. No one is ever holding them accountable. They are the people who are the top dogs. And so that was a really difficult situation that we had to deal with. And thankfully she still went on the record with us after that because she was so enraged at what was happening to her.
Thank you for answering that. Melissa, my question was about that. Like, how do you protect your sources from retaliation after your story's done? Like, I understand they're anonymous, but just like your investigative journalist, they can just reduce that too, like, how do you navigate that?
Our sources were not anonymous. I mean, quite a few of them went on the record. And so it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, for us, all we can do is offer them a chance to, tell us what they say had happened to them. I think there was some protection in knowing that all of this is out there. And so I think that made it a bit more difficult. I can say she has not been thrown back in jail since this is the second story that we did about the sheriff who was accused of sexual abuse and repeatedly raping a woman who was incarcerated in his jail. This was that woman, and so she hasn't been back to jail. The whole town knows what's been going on. I think there's protection in that. But really it's a crapshoot. I mean, you really never know, and you just hope you hope that they make the right choices to protect themselves and hope for the best, really.
Any other?
Hi there. This may be a softball question, but maybe not. But it struck me in a time when journalism is under threat and the pay is probably worse than it was 20 years ago, and you're facing threats like this. Why do you do what you do?
Great question.
I mean, I think
I've done it so long. There's nothing else to do. So,
I'm sure you're hireable in other fields.
I think an obvious answer is that the work feels valuable and important, but I think an underappreciated thing about investigative reporting, at least for me, is how interesting it is and how fun it is to do. The story took me to such strange places. That's a funny thing to say about New Jersey, but it really did. Strange places within New Jersey and put me in contact with such interesting people who have just such different lives than me. And I love that's what my daily work is talking to people who are very different from me and learning about their lives and their experience. So it's fun.
Yeah, Casey and I received so many emails from families and whose parents, for example, may have struggled in nursing homes, and just getting some of those notes that said like, like lifted my heart to see that this got coverage. That in and of itself is pretty gratifying to see.
I like to say that we have the best jobs in the world. I think for me personally, seeing the women who came forward to talk about what had happened to them and hearing their gratitude, I think does it for me. A lot of these people that we spoke with, whether it be for the Goon Squad story or any of the other stories that we did, they're people who want nothing more than to be believed about the abuses that they've experienced. And I think just the first step of talking to someone, I think was the most gratifying for them and for all of us as a team, really coming together and for a lot of these people, it was the first time that they'd ever talked about some of the horrific things that they experienced. So
There's always a sense of, with us, as righteous, we call it righteous indignation. You just get pissed about certain things you see out there that aren't right, and um, if not for a lot of the journalism that's done, it wouldn't be right. And we're still in a fighting battle in that regard. But I think it's a personal thing. I think it's one that just you're drawn to that kind of work for those very reasons. And not all of our colleagues are the same way. Has a different bent, but we're really bent. So.
On that note, I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate investigative journalism and being so thoughtful and engaging with this panel. And I hope you can join me in congratulating these extraordinary finalists and journalists on their work.